Steven, it's great to have you. I remember you since maybe like 10 years ago when FinTech revolution was about to start, and you were in forefront of that at DBS. But I would like to ask you, looking back over these years of working with large enterprises, now that we enter a new cycle of revolution with AI, I wonder, what do you think banks or enterprise in general got wrong about AI?
I think, firstly, the expectation of what the effective use cases for AI are, what the limitations of AI are, and then the mathematical side of that equation. One of the things that we can see in all of tech is that it's better at mathematics in many ways than humans. It's outperforming humans in some areas and creating new areas of mathematics, risk management, etc. However, it also has limitations in requiring validation. So often banks are very hesitant to go and deploy it, but in part because also the regulator is very hesitant to go and let those use cases run. And I think this goes back to one systemic reason, and that is we have this binary expectation of technology. I, O, it's right or it's wrong. So I'll give an example. In Japan, a prefecture implemented an AI to do responses on a website. Simple thing. And it was only 94% accurate. So they shelved the program. And here I'm thinking, which one of you guys working there has been consistently getting 94% and knowing that that will improve over time? So I think our expectations have to be realigned to understand that technology is no longer binary. It's actually probabilistic and makes many mistakes the same way that humans make mistakes. And let me give you an example about that. I'm testing a new AI spreadsheeting tool. So it's pre-market and phenomenal. But it came up and I let it run itself, create a model, and then it said, oh, someone made a mistake in cell A3. And I'm like, well, someone had better fix it. And I think that there's two interesting things about that. One is that it referred to itself as someone. Second, that it actually assigned blame to a human being as being the source of that error. I thought that's also interesting. But third is also that need to have some sort of domain expertise that you can recognize what the issue is. And I think that, AI in general is still in a very investigative phase because you can't rely on it entirely. You need to go through validation. And I don't think we've kind of set up that framework within the technology teams within banking. I don't think the regulator has that view of AI. It too needs to learn and all that sort of thing. So to get up to speed with what AI is good at, what it isn't good at, and then how do you put the right controls and checks around it, which often can't necessarily rely on AI to get those controls and checks. It can create the frameworks to do so, but may not create the validations that you need to get it done.
So essentially what you're saying that the sort of distrust in AI from enterprise is coming from sort of these hallucinations or ambiguous sort of results that is the major sort of barrier for adoption of AI by enterprise?
It is, but we've got to understand what hallucination is. And I'll give a perfect human example because all of this is in the data that's around us, right? So if I'm a Republican in the US, I will think that obviously the Democrats are wrong and that they're hallucinating. What's a Democrat going to think? And all of their data, it's going to say that the Republicans are hallucinating and that they're wrong. So in other words, because AI is using the data that's generated, it's inherently, we can't blame it for hallucinating when we can't even do it as human beings. So we have to understand those sorts of limitations, and those limitations in the data get amplified through synthetic data and all the things that go around that. So being able to control that is also a matter of human perspective and judgment as to what is correct, etc. So it's not an easy problem to solve, but there are ways and structures that you can work around it to try and solve those issues.
So you can't rely on AI, yet you need to allow this to make mistakes.
you need to be ready for it to make mistakes, and you need to be ready to mitigate those mistakes. And, it's interesting as you're working with some of these tool sets to see how it's thinking and solving. And if you're watching closely enough, it actually informs you as to some of the mistakes it's making. So it's an interesting dichotomy to go and watch that interaction play between man and machine. But I don't think that either is perfect. And so whenever you have imperfection on both sides of that equation, you've got to be prepared for some probability of risk, some probability of failure. And I think that, we've got to get ourselves away from binary thinking.
Let's talk a little bit about the risk and failure. You have very unique mix of experiences, and you started your career not in a bank. You started your career in the cockpit of the commercial airplane, where the cost of mistake or failure is catastrophic. Flying a jet is basically requires a very disciplined approach to mitigate all possible risk. And when it comes to innovation or disruption, it's often taking the risk. How does it work in your case when you now, with this experience, with this approach, looking at these problems, and how do you solve that when it comes to, let's say, the use case of AI implementation within financial services?
Okay, that's a great question. So if I can explain a cockpit, right? So when you learn to fly, you have a bunch of instruments, right? And you fly into cloud, you have to trust that those instruments work. And so your life depends on it, and you're forced to make very quick decisions based on the data that you're given. But an important part of that training is to work out when one of those indications is inaccurate. So you're inherently learning to triangulate failure, right? And it becomes a part of the way that you think. So for me, that began my whole journey into technology and automating in spreadsheets and double checking everything to make sure that I could help triangulate where mistakes were and all that sort of thing. So, and then my history evolved. But that foundation taught me two of the most valuable things that helped me with all sorts of transformation, just non-technical transformation, but also technical transformation. And that is that the first lesson I had is you can, trust but verify. You trust your instruments, but you have to verify the results to make sure that they line up and are not throwing you outliers, right? The second is that technology arbitrages time. Technology enables you to do things at speed and scale that you wouldn't be able to do yourself with the constraints of some level of accuracy and checking. And why that's really important, because if you look at everything our financial system operates on, the bottom part of that equation is always time. If I say your return on capital is over a year is 10%, what happens if you can do 10% in a day? What does that do to return on capital? So anytime you shorten time, you're actually going to increase the value return for that unit of time. And that has a remarkable impact across everything that you do in financial services. So for me, being able to start to think logically around from that base as to how you approach problems, and to have the curiosity to check what's driving that assumption. And I think that, when my first experience in financial service, I'd come from the tech industry, right? So first software industry, then the hardware industry. And I used to develop pricing models for Dell and for Compaq and stuff. And so because of my spreadsheeting skills that I taught myself as a pilot, I started to question, I'd look at payments and I'd go, from a supply chain standpoint, this makes no sense the way that Visa and MasterCard operate. You've got single entry bookkeeping. This doesn't compute. And so, that led me to, creating Citibank's first mobile payments patent, which is, I think, incredibly widely used now. It was never filed globally, but barcode on the phone for mobile payments. So that's your ID exchange. And then what I called multi-entry bookkeeping. Today you call it a ledger. So you had all these ways of independently checking and balancing every transaction, right? Which is the foundation I would discover. That was in 2002. It was filed. It's a filed and granted patent in Singapore. And but you'll find that that's the basis of all our thinking of blockchain. And that's not to say I was smart. It's to say I was a simpleton and I couldn't understand the way things that worked today, back in 2002. It just didn't make sense to me. So, I have these values I live by, passion, integrity, tenacity, curiosity, and humility. So life's a pitch. But it's really true. I tried to, it's at the heart of everything I do is to make sure that, I try to understand at a very fundamental why we do what we do. And when you take that thinking into a team and you take the humility is important, because if you're not humble, you can't learn. So, if you take that curiosity in a team, you can generate some fairly awesome results.
And when it comes to humility, empathy, it's in broader terms. That's where AI is not that strong, or appearing not to be.
It's very good at recognizing empathy. And, what I love about, going back to my pilot days, what I had to do was to tailor myself to the aircraft, right? So everything I have to do has to fit within the constraints of an aircraft and how information is displayed and operated, etc. What's super interesting about AI is it does understand, it can read your emotion, it can do everything, it can understand the nuance of the language that you're using and all that. So it can respond now and tailor itself to me. And that's a massive breakthrough, right? So if you think of it, when Steve Jobs made technology so simple that you could swipe, and now that attracted 2 new generations of users, little kids, like babies can use tech now, right? And AI is like that. AI is actually the first generation of technology that drives that same level of inclusion, because communication is about talking and being understood. All we're good at now as human beings is talking. We're not, unless you're really switched on with empathy, you can't really ensure you're being understood. You can't personalize your communication every time. And I think that that's the promise and the opportunity with AI, is to actually use it for those tools. Now, does it really have empathy? No, it's an algo, right? So maybe
It pretends it has.
it synthesizes information that helps it react as if it does. So, at the end of the day, we're programming AI to reflect some of the values and experiences, all the programmers have had over time, and their perspectives and the way that they judge it, and it assimilates their values. And then more broadly from the data sets that they work with. But I think it's a hugely promising thing. And one last point on that is, I think that this is the first technology where old people have an advantage, because you have the ability to ask the right questions, and you have an ability to see the responses and to be able to go, that's not quite right. Whereas one of the risks with the young generation is that they don't necessarily know how to make those distinctions. I don't think they know the right questions to ask yet, because they haven't been exposed to all of that practicality. And the second is that they don't have the ability to sense, or that whether something is not quite right. That number in line 300 and something of a spreadsheet is just, that can't be correct. When you're just looking at it from a data perspective, I think they lack some of the ability to synthesize that into effective insight, and that insight really matters today.
It's interesting because what essentially is happening with AI replacing sort of junior jobs, and then as a double hit with, even though the junior can operate AI, but they can't operate as they should have if they would have an experience. So we're in a situation when you have basically AI taking the most of the sort of the basic stuff. So what's going to happen to young people?
So I find that particularly concerning, not just for that reason. So because they're learning from an average. Don't forget, the outcomes of AI lead us to an homogeneous average, right? Whereas everything in business is about creating a symmetry. So young kids have this huge value to offer in that they will see things that we don't see, because they're looking at it from a much simpler perspective, and we know that simplicity matters, right? Whereas, with an AI, you're effectively taking the universe of information, condensing it, and coming out with essentially the same, hopefully in the future, the same answers for everything, right? So, but that doesn't create you competitive asymmetry in a market. That's not going to create the best, outcomes necessarily unless we change the fundamental of how AI works, because we're going to be delivering consistent, accurate, averages of everything because it's probabilistic. So thinking about asymmetry gives me hope for the future for young people that see something that the data doesn't represent. And don't forget, when we start our AI systems and we ingest all that data, that becomes the baseline. So to ask something that, all of that data today, like we discussed earlier in financial services, is assumed that, you know, that base data says that there are 365.4 days per year, that there are 30 days in a month for a mortgage, all that sort of thing. It doesn't question the logic of, well, how did we get to that original assumption?
So when it comes to young people, the sort of element of naivety in a way or lack of experience gives them an actual advantage to question the status quo of things.
100%.
Anyway, like look at I saw the photo of the team from Lovable that just got $200 million funding, one of the fastest unicorns in Europe.
Yeah.
And I think they're barely like over than 25 years old. So which leads me to, and if you see like Y Combinator, all these teams are like, an average, pretty young. And within this era of AI, because they don't have this baggage of sort of assumptions and stereotypes, they could just challenge the way how we approach things and how we do things, and use the AI as a tool to basically disrupt the way of the things that have been done before. How does it work with these sort of more experienced people now, who are sort of left on the sideline of this sort of dynamics?
Love the question. So yeah, I'm a fan, and I've been using Lovable quite a bit, and Replit, and all the tools I try to understand, and particularly because I think that is the future of being able for business people being able to actually now take the prototypes in their head that they can't do because they don't know how to code, and being able to now get it to a prototype that people can understand, so you can communicate and be understood. But more than that, when you apply now the synthetic data side of a business, you could actually do all the business modeling that begins to validate what you could do with that model. So I think it puts the power in the people that actually have that insight to create. So I'm a huge fan. But what a young person might miss with Lovable and Replit, and I've had accounts with both, and I've closed both because they don't see all the errors that crop up, and they don't, the first time you use it, it's like, fantastic, this is just this great representation of what you want. But then you start looking and going, no, that's wrong. That's not right. Oh, that's a huge error. I thought we'd connected to an API and that's real data. This is just a hard-coded number that you guys have thrown in there. And so you see some of these things start to creep into, well, it doesn't actually do anything that I need it to actually do to create value in the real world. It's great to have this hypothesis thing. It's great to have a functional but non-working prototype. But how do you translate that to the real world? That hasn't happened yet. I think that's the future of what will happen with that technology. But I think young people using it run the risk of thinking that they've got something and they'll show it, and then it'll completely and utterly fall over through the first person that actually questions it from a factual basis. And we know in innovation that when you've got a senior guy that goes, that's a mistake, then that's almost the end of your project, right? You're on defense.
And the AI usually replies, oh, right.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I missed that.
Yeah. If I can sort of draw the analogy with, say, financial service industry, I remember like 10 years ago, we were all inspired by the wave of change coming into this industry. There were all these talks about that, that FinTech will eat banks' lunch. Realistically, if you look back and over these years, I don't really see that much of disruption happen. Yes, you have a few unicorns, you have a few success, Stripe, I don't know,
Sure.
somewhat Revolut, Nubank, or, in payments. But you don't really see a tectonic shift. You don't see a fundamental change. Banks caught up relatively fast on
but
sort
that
of
is
UX.
the fundamental change, right? So the banks had this huge data advantage. So what does a lot of tech rely on? It relies on the data and the quality of that data. And banks had it. They just weren't using it. And, my philosophy from an innovation standpoint was, you sit on all this amazing data in a bank. The real value is when you can put that data in a customer's hands. So I have these three acronym maxims of any digital project, right? And the first is time to value, then time to quality, and then time to scale, right? These are the three elements of any digital initiative. And so if you look at time to value, there's the first one is time to value for the customer. Is it valuable for the customer? If not, why are we doing it, right? And banks had an inherent advantage out of that because they had enormous amounts of data. So case in point, banks were sitting on, say, a large Singaporean bank, as an example, would have all the data of every property price or most of the property prices and their past transaction values. Now, wouldn't you want your customer to understand what the prior price, whether they're getting a good deal on that property? How can you increase the value of them dealing with you? And then how can you, in a smart way, use that to continuously collect new data that actually, starts filling out the application process. And then by the time they apply, it's super easy, right? That's the sort of thinking that you need to employ to really have an advantage. Now, a startup in that market is, FinTech, great tech, but it doesn't have the data. It doesn't have a whole lot of things that go around it. So there was this natural advantage in the sleepy banks. You just had to wake them up, and FinTech did that. So the reason we have usable apps nowadays is because of FinTech. Now, Stripe. Were there anyone really working that back-end API? No, they kind of went into the blue ocean space, right? PayPal, when PayPal started, they were blue ocean space, right? They sort of snuck under the radar of where the banks could actually operate to create something that was kind of, person to person. Now, banks really didn't do that. It was like, we'll transfer and you get money 5 days later. Okay, that's really good. But, you had this wide open market. And now for many of the payment things, as you've seen, the banks have caught up.
But also, I find that might be, from a point of view, the another biggest challenge for all the fintechs essentially became the trust. Bank owned the trust. And if you ask an average person, where would they prefer to keep their savings? In the app in the phone or in the bank? Brick and mortar, yes, might be extremely boring going to cashier, but then I'm feeling safe because I have this trust. That is extremely difficult to gain for young fintech tech companies. But if you draw this analogy to nowadays with AI, where we're also facing a massive trust issue that we just discussed in the beginning. So how you see that it might actually change or affect this dynamics of adoption of AI going forward? And essentially, where do you see the breakthrough?
Many years ago, I was working with the CEO of a bank, and I ran a big data day back when that was relatively new, right? And we brought in pretty phenomenal speakers, that had, the guy that developed analytics for Netflix, all these sorts of guys, right? And one of the guys hopped up and said that, in fact, our opening pitch, and we'd guided the whole conversation through the day, right? We actually wouldn't let Palantir pitch because they couldn't communicate effectively what they could do in financial services. So even though they had great tech, they didn't know how to sell it. But we crafted this story, and the opening thing was that banks, the telcos had invested in, I think 3G back then, and they were going to take the market. And then what they called the over-the-top players, right? OTT came over the top, the Microsofts, Googles, and everything, and completely intermediated the customer relationship and took the market and the value, right? The tech companies took all the value, and and the telcos were left being dumb balance sheets. And then he said this. He said, banks run the risk of becoming dumb balance sheets. The CEO of this bank was up on his feet. And he said, this is ridiculous. There is trust in banks and da, 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 da. And I'm saying that's a perception, not a reality. And the reason was because we're just exited Lehman, where technically most of the banks around the world, if that had, been able to continue on its merry way, would have been wiped. So trust is a perception, not necessarily a reality. But then that same CEO was quoted, and I kept the article, I think it was about 4 or 5 years later, saying banks run the risk of becoming dumb balance sheets. So these things kind of resolve over time. But what that ended up doing is catalyzing action to make sure that didn't happen. And so, I think that trust issue is something that, actually at the time, Apple had better trust recognition than any bank. So could Apple have moved on the market? Yeah, I think they probably could have
They
at that time.
attempted in certain way with Marcus.
They never quite got to understanding finance properly. I think that's the issue. I had a meeting once lined up with Google, and through a friend that introduced us to Sergey, I think, and then Eric Schmidt, and then got pushed to head of payments. Citi wanted to move with us, but Google, just didn't quite realize what they should have done. Their business model was made around using free information, right? So basically, they became the information source for the world. They didn't charge for search. They charged for the services that they created around search, advertising, etc. So then they tried to move into the payments market and just adopted an old model where you just charge transaction fees. It's like, okay, why don't you make payments free? Because the data around a payment is worth a multiple of the payment fee if you know what to do with it. And the problem is they didn't know what to do with it. So, people have to, can't just make a superficial observation. They need to really dive deep to understand, how defensible that position is and all that sort of thing. So it took an awful long time for Google Wallet to become remotely valuable, right? As it has, did for Apple.
But I still feel like a lot of fintechs underestimate, the importance of the trust. Or
That's
even
correct.
though they understand the importance, but it's extremely difficult to get to build this trust. And interestingly, use case in Hong Kong was the originally digital banks. And I know you're on the board of another digital bank in UAE, but in Hong Kong, the digital banks initially were called the virtual banks. And virtual banks, sort of, I can allow myself to translate them directly in Cantonese, is something like would be something doesn't exist, something made of thin air, which didn't really help with the trust. Now that they recognize that the regulator changed it and allowed to change it to digital banks. But I think it's just gives an sort of an illustration towards this a massive trust issue, which I also think now when it comes to AI going forward and adoption of AI, by enterprise, among the people, where we are now within this sort of trust or sort of hype, where we will realize we shouldn't trust it yet. Don't you afraid that when this realization will hit most of us, then there will be a massive drop in distrust
I 100% agree with you. And I for instance, I canceled my GPT subscription recently. I got into an argument with it, silly as that sounds, but I had to do a deep research report, and it's kept on promising tomorrow. And I thought, wow, you're becoming very human, right? and then it got to this thing, and I said, I'll get it to you by the 28th of June. And I said, well, that's fantastic, but it's July 3, and 28th is back, it's 4 days ago. And it couldn't recognize time. It didn't have that concept. And, for me, it's like, if you don't understand time, then you don't understand anything that's valuable to me, because you can't have an effective operation. And I think that, there are limitations within AI and its data sets and how it's being constructed that become very apparent when you use enough of them. And I use lots, right? That make you question the whole trust of that information. So, if you do a deep research report, yeah, fantastic. It can assimilate 14, 15 minutes or, usually, and you've got insights that you couldn't possibly have had, in that period of time, But then to verify all that, that's going to cost you weeks and weeks and weeks, right? So are you really moving ahead? Are you assimilating information that perhaps you didn't need to go verify, that wasn't really that important, if you have to now take the totality of being able to trust that data? And I think that, like you say, as we get over the hype cycle and start going on to the next trial of disillusionment, that you'll start seeing that drop off, because you can't trust it in its own right. I don't trust it with mathematics at all. I will build independent mathematics to the side that I can verify, that I can build in cross checks to, that and I'll find that happy medium where I can use what LLMs are really good at, working around specifically with language, being able to tailor that language to the particular customer, all those sorts of things, and then pulling that data that you actually need to be correct into those conversations. I don't think it's worth an institution's reputation and trust to not have all those checks and balances in place. And I think that that's what's slowing down the rollout within the financial institutions. And just one minor correction, it's not a digital bank. Even though we look that way in the UK, it's actually an SME bank, leading SME bank in the UAE. And we do have branches, though very few now.
Let's continue maybe a little bit of topic of trust. Where do you see the solution? Is it that the LLMs will evolve over the time? They will have less mistakes and we'll develop more trust? Or we just need to apply a sort of this distrust from the start and act from there, and where we would be able to fully rely on AI and let it deal with the stuff that we ask them to do without being sort of suspicious about whether what their AI produces is that true or not.
So I think, and I've tried all the things: use only these valid sources, use all this, and the opposite of that, do not use these sources, and all this sort of stuff. So it's still got a long way to go. But I don't think for the reasons we discussed earlier, that Republicans versus Democrats are going to believe both are hallucinating, right? So you'll never have perfection. But what you seem to lack now, and I'll give a use case. I was playing around with this spreadsheet AI, and I asked it to do something very simple. I said, firstly, make sure there are no hard numbers in the spreadsheet, move them all to an assumptions page. And then I want you to color code, just to double check, every single hard-coded number I want you to display in color teal, right? Which I use always to distinguish in a spreadsheet. And it got partway through it and then just kind of gave up, right? So half the numbers, I'm like, it's, because it's running too many things in parallel that are conflicting, right? So really getting into sequencing and all that sort of stuff becomes incredibly important. But the other limitation is, of course, compute. So I don't see us solving all of that until you actually, until quantum starts rising, right? When you have just this incredible compute power, low cost compute power, which is the promise of quantum, that will actually enable you to go, and audit those numbers, with every check and every production that you make and every variance. I think we've got a long way to go to be able to provide that sort of veracity to ensuring that the outputs of those controlled data sources are actually delivering you the right outputs that you need to operate. So I don't see that happening in the short term. And I think we'll have to live with understanding the limitations of AI within our application use cases and working out there is value in it, but working out where that value is and how to apply it and how to make sure that that yields value for the customer, back for you, that it yields at the quality that you require, and that it can scale, help you scale like mad.
Recently, you've probably seen this too. Quite a few CEOs and founders publish their letters internal to the staff. We have to go all the way AI. If you're not using AI, you're obsolete. Encouraging their employees, their staff, to essentially weaponize themselves with AI and experiment with AI. Now, you went through a few cycles of bringing innovation in multiple organizations, very complex organizations, with a lot of complex systems inside. And and you face this resistance often, misunderstanding, sort of fear of innovation. When it comes to application or sort of applying AI within the day-to-day jobs within their employees, what the approach you think would be the most efficient to achieve a certain a scale and a real application of AI in the day-to-day tasks?
So firstly, within the context of companies, I refer to AI as amplified intelligence. Forget the artificial thing, right? Because unless you've got people that are smart that can actually validate and do all those
Amplified
things.
intelligence.
Amplified. I'm amplifying human beings, right? Because if you're effective at scaling and your business doubles or triples, the people shouldn't become a question, right? There will be some reskilling for sure, but you really want to amplify the intelligence that you have within the organization, because by definition, you shouldn't be hiring idiots into your company, right? And there is experience within institutions, be it, when I was with AIA, there were people that were way smarter than me at both AIA and DBS, some. And then, how do you amplify that experience? Because, generally as individuals, we operate in silos. I mean, I've been lucky in my career to move across many silos, but I always find that within silos, they're usually quite efficient because you have very smart people that are generating really phenomenal results from within that thing. But the value, if you look at technology is a horizontal, it's not a vertical, right? And it cuts across everything. And really the value is when you find all of this inefficiency between all those silos, right? So, being able to firstly have the experience that's amplifying their experience and their knowledge now gives you a multiplier back here. So one of the important things that I taught all my innovation teams was, firstly, it is the soul destroying job, right? And the reason is because your mark of success is when someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, I've invented this new good thing," right? And you have to sit there and go, "Oh, wow, that's really good," right? And the reason that you should just be humble enough to say, "Yeah, fantastic, you're super innovative and this is a great solution," even though you gave it to them, I think is the mark of success, because now other people own it, and they own it with a whole bunch of other people that have that domain expertise that can take it to a level that you couldn't, because at the time I was a corporate banker primarily when I first went to DBS. And, so I knew the corporate banking space really well, but had I run a consumer bank by then? Getting my times wrong. But, I had run a consumer bank. So I knew consumer banking at the time, but I didn't know treasury and things like that, right? So how do you, leverage the experience in each of those, and how do you get them to take ownership? So I'll give an example. I love spreadsheets, and I developed, around supply chain and working capital for many years. I developed Dell's pricing models and stuff like this. And so I understood that space inside, outside, and backwards, right? So I passed a spreadsheet off to my CFO, passed it off to someone in the GTS group, who then came, passed it off for someone to go and redevelop it. And they basically reskinned it, changed the colors, and then they added some really cool new things into that mix. And then the guy presented it back to me and goes, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, wow, that's really cool." "Yeah, I developed it." And I'm like, yeah, watch out for cell, A33, right? But the point was, I didn't say anything, other than to warn him about, one area I still had concern, but he owned it now, right? And the group owned it. And that actually, I was told later, is, the primary profit driver now at DBS. So you want to leverage and amplify that expertise by, leveraging that knowledge base that you have within the company. And that's something that's, I don't think AI necessarily has access to many of those, top level talents, because they're not publishing their stuff publicly. University or professors and things do, but, your top corporate guys do not, right? They're publishing their information within the secure compound of a company. And that becomes a symmetry which creates an advantage. So you want those people.
But how do you get into this, even get there where they come to you and say, "Look, I developed that"? How do you even start with letting people to actually...
Education, right? So we ran we would run these learning things. Let me teach you about big data. Let me teach you about social. Let me
So like a
teach
classroom
you.
step or
Some of them were like TED Talks for top 400 people in the bank, or working with HR to run the leadership series for all the high potentials, those sorts of things. And then DBS went one step further, which I loved, right? And that was after me, so all credit to them, right? And they started teaching everyone design thinking. That might have happened when I was there. And then they started teaching everyone Python, because if you're scared of a tech or scared of a new capability, your natural reaction when you're fearful is to say no, right? Because you don't know, it's risky, right? Now, the moment you empower people with that technology, so then they're in a position to make better decisions to say yes. So for me, whenever I was told no, which was very frequently, almost universally, every project I ever started with a no. And me, no just meant that it meant not yet. Right?
and no, it comes from the top and
Yeah,
from
so
the bottom
I actually
or
have these
both.
slides. You'll have to imagine it. But I say no means people don't know. And your job is to, as an entrepreneur, internal or external, is to turn no into now. And if you can turn, an absolute no into now, then you're going to be successful. And so to do that, for instance, recently I went through an experience where I'm like, you guys need to look at quantum computing from a cybersecurity standpoint, right? You've got CISA in the US really pushing hard, and you're seeing, if you look at it, error correction was something we used to have error correction code in servers back when I was running product at Dell and Compaq. So dealing with errors is nothing new to computing, and quantum is a level more difficult, but you now also got some tools that are helping you get there. And almost every week you're seeing new advancements that get you closer and closer and closer to accuracy, right? So I'm saying this is something we need to look at urgently. And at first it's like quantum, it's 20 years away and all this sort of thing. I'm like, I don't think so. And so I just start a campaign, quiet campaign. I just send, this latest development, just showing what's happening out of MIT, send, credible sources of information and advancements that are occurring through the universities and all this sort of thing, up to the point where people go, yeah, we need to act on it now. So, and it's a big thing,
But
quantum.
it may take some time, and we have a competition, and the pressure of the competition, the new competitors coming in, equipped with more sort of efficient tools. How do you sort of make this journey from no to now faster?
It always comes down to the quality of people in the organization, and the willingness of CEOs to either empower action or to get involved in helping, make that action happen faster. And I think I've been very lucky in working with, CEOs that I've really learned a lot from, such as Mark Tucker at AIA, who I really respect. Also, Piyush at DBS. One thing, Piyush and I used to disagree violently frequently, but one thing I always admired about Piyush was he could say no and he could walk it back once you had proven it to him.
So accepting your mistakes.
Yeah, and don't forget, I'm making mistakes every day of the week, right? So we all do. We're human. But the importance is to have that, that openness to continue learning about something, to be able to change that stance. And I think that organizations really should value that. And I've been lucky, I work with a phenomenal board and a phenomenal CEO and leadership team in Rockbank in the UAE. And if you look at the results and what they're doing and, all the public information, in a very short period of time, that bank has really transformed, right? So it shows the power of what you can achieve when you have good people who align behind a vision and really get committed to making that change.
You're saying CEOs should essentially help to sort of speed up this process, but how? What exactly CEO can do? Like if you are now in a position of the CEO of the company, now you look at what's going on. Obviously, you're under pressure. There's competition, maybe shareholders, maybe you're in the founder sort of role, and you really want your team to start doing things much better, faster, more efficiently using AI. What are the exact steps? You mentioned education.
So I've got an acronym for it: learning, venturing, and capital. Right. So firstly, you've got to hit the learning phase. People have to. Here's GPT. Okay. Well, that's really nice. What do you do with it? Right. Well, where do you apply it? Okay. Just use it as a checking mechanism for your code, not the public version. You don't want your code out in public, but
You can install even local one.
right, or your local LLM, right? So, but the point is, you've got to start getting experience. Experiential learning is the most powerful form of learning. So, in Japan, for instance, which is the analytics capital of the world in terms of trying to analyze every possible outcome before they take one safe step forward, right? So I was asked by a leading company in Japan to come up with one slide that captured the challenge of innovation in Japan, and I got AI to create a picture of all these scientists in white coats looking around a bike, saying, how could I ride a bike? And it was like, get on the bike. So experiential learning is kind of the first piece. You've got to get people engaged with it. And that's what I loved about, DBS and teaching everyone Python and all this sort of thing. You got to get engagement so people feel comfortable with that technology and willing to experiment, right? And that's kind of step one. If you don't have learning, then why are you throwing money at it? Why are you doing all this sort of thing? So venturing is now applying the learning to come up with, even if it's a prototype or whatever, of what your vision for how you can change process. And importantly, you should not just be doing, like is too common in Japan, digitizing an existing process. You should have a first principles look at how do you redefine that value proposition, right? And then time to value, time to quality, time to scale. And, so now you've got the venturing. When you've got the venturing done, now it's like, okay, now's the time, CEO, now please go and put proper money behind this to go and scale what we've proven. And what I love about AI is we're now in a position that we can start accelerating each of those pieces, right? So you're using it as a way of amplifying you to, increase the velocity of that happening. So I think, AI is a very useful tool set, has its limitations, but, really accelerating that learning, venturing, and capital phase. Yeah, it's magic.
But how do you motivate employees in the first place to learn Python or experiment?
So I think firstly, DBS made it mandatory for everyone. But I don't think it needs to be mandatory.
So it's like, I order you.
It's part of your training program. You don't get your bonus and whatever until you go and sit through these courses. We do it for compliance. We do it for regulatory. Of course, it's as important to understand technology skills in today's age as it is for any of those other things, right? So I think it is a very important thing that needs to be mandated. The reason that DBS changed, right? And it was I actually did an AI analysis of reading all the financial reports. And what it was known for innovation in the year prior to me joining was, what was it? It was risk or compliance innovation or something, right?
Which is
fantastic.
Oxymoron.
And right. And so it's quite interesting. But then, it began. And it wasn't due to me. It was due to a lot of people starting to get behind the program, right? But, that learning thing, I think most people that join a company don't come in and go, oh, great, I've got this new job and I just want to keep it as it is, the status quo. Everyone actually has this inner drive, I believe, that wants to contribute and be recognized for contributing. So you've kind of, as a management and leadership team, you got to make sure you have that recognition and you've got to drive that permission rather than threat of failure and you're going to be sacked if you've made a mistake. Experiential learning, if you stopped a child from walking, as the old adage is, because, he fell the first time, don't walk anymore. Or if you don't expect to fall off a bike when you start riding, it's just not real. So you've got to expect a certain amount of errors, but you should limit it, right? So if you actually, do your proper risk management, your releases and all this sort of thing, you can manage that. That's a mathematical process, right, for me. And, so you've got to kind of create the layering that goes around it. So my number one partner at DBS in transformation was HR. And very specifically, I'll name him, Tom Pedersen, who was the head of talent management for DBS. He still advises DBS because he's just a super smart guy, did stuff for Facebook, all that sort of thing. But he was the right partner that actually took that learning inside and institutionalized it in the company. So I always, every week, including next week, I'll take Tom out for beers in Tokyo, and
So
as we do.
what you're saying is it's not even job of CIO, but actually essentially HR.
I think HR play a tremendous role. I think that where I've seen not as much traction as I've seen in other places, that they've had very mediocre HR. Which is a shame. I saw one HR leader who talked a great game, presentations, and then her own team weren't empowered to actually present initiatives that they wanted to do to her. And I'm like, that's just nuts, right? So you've really got to make sure you work with a HR team that can actually walk the talk, right? And I've seen it work really, really well. I've seen where it doesn't work because I don't believe there was authenticity in the messaging. But where you actually have it, where there is authenticity in it, and where there are people working together to make it happen, and when you're incorporating the learning programs and all this sort of thing, it's a formula for success. And you see it in the financials. So this is all measurable. Everything in digital, as you know, is measurable. And that's a wonderful thing.
But now witness a lot of this sort of open letters to my team by founders. There's sometimes they say things like, if you're not innovating with AI, you will lose your job, essentially. Maybe wrapped in a better way, but essentially the message they're sending, if you're not start to learn the AI now, you'll be replaced by someone else or by AI itself. Where do you think the fear could be a motivation, or where the limitation of the fear is a motivation? Should we apply fears in this context? Because people already sort of frighten the whole thing. And we essentially ask employees to learn how to apply AI, which some of them may suspect to replace their own jobs.
I went through an experience where, I created the world's first AI underwriting company, right? So for life and health, for the insurance industry. And, there was a fear by actuaries that they would be replaced. And, it was my failure that I did not give them or help them understand the implications of what they were doing. So the simple business case was that it was an accepted number in the organization that the revenue would double if you could basically speed up the whole process, right? And it's like, absolutely, that's a job for machine learning, AI, all that sort of thing.
What's in it for me?
Right? Now, the question is for the actuaries. It's like they just looked at it and went, this is job replacement, right? So we don't want a bar of that. And it's like, AI, the actuaries and underwriters. And that's actually a fair call because they weren't told the implications of, well, if you were to achieve that double scale of the business, then you're probably going to need more actuaries and things to go and start looking at, the next things, which of course, the whole industry is looking at now, right? You could have now accelerated, starting to get data from different sources, all those sorts of things. So, having, that education process, I think is super critical to making success. And it needs to be carrot and stick. The guys, the actuaries that don't start embracing tech and don't work out, how to amplify their outcomes and all that sort of thing. Yeah, they run the risk of being replaced, but you don't want to harp on that. You want to harp on, for me, like the ability to learn something new, to, for me to be more productive, to take away, all the hard, just imagine you're doing all those equations on paper and working, forget it, right? You use tech for those things. And you work out, using your experience and your insight, how do you open up an entirely new field that actually gives you, an enormous runway. And I think that that's kind of what's missing in many projects that fail, is that there hasn't been that equal investment in time to actually get people recovered. So, in this particular instance, we had a major insurance company in the US. So, and their actuaries pushed back and they said, no, it's too risky to use this alternate. And, it's like, well, you guys are in risk. So, risk is in any insurance or banking measured by a number. Give me the number, because we'd exceeded every number that they gave us, right? And then their only response was, it's too risky, which meant that they weren't really concerned about the number. They were really concerned about their jobs. And I had completely and utterly missed, the opportunity to get on the front foot with that.
But it's also true that quite a few jobs probably will disappear, or
Yeah,
AI
absolutely.
will replace it. So this likelihood that they will go away in mass is very high. But how how would you motivate them to equip themselves with AI, knowing that they would probably lose their job in the future?
Firstly, with every evolution of technology, there is job loss. But usually, what we see in technology markets is that you actually get growth in jobs, right? Because you're now creating efficiencies and all that sort of thing. So, but the skill sets that are required change, right? Which almost goes back to the learning, venturing capital. You want people to jump on that learning train early so that they're amplifying themselves and moving and improving their skill sets. So, and actually in banks that I've worked at, I had, for instance, engineers complaining that they would be replaced and the data science guys are making too much money and all this sort of thing. And I'm like, you have the ability to be both, right? You've got the mathematical skills as engineers and all this sort of thing, but you need to train yourselves as data scientists. And then when the moment that you can do both of those roles, right, that you could actually execute what you see on the data science side and execute it through code, I said you have a natural advantage over the data science market. So how do you find similar paths for people? And this is, again, goes to HR and why HR is really important, because you've got to help them imagine what that future is, to help upgrade those skill sets. And I've had engineers that actually went that path from within the institutions that they were working.
You touched interesting topic as and in the era of AI, you would probably need a sort of a generalist approach where you have a certain understanding and a certain level in multiple discipline in order for you to orchestrate the AI to do multiple jobs at the same time. Is that the case? You see it also in more like generalists will win in the sort of near future of AI adoption?
Do you know, it's interesting. There's a argument on both sides for that, right? Because deep domain expertise is something that's still valuable because, again, most of that data sits within companies and all that sort of thing. So, AI may not be generally exposed today to a lot of that data. I could be wrong. And so, there is definitely value in deep domain. And what you see, for instance, in coding as an example, the code that's produced by a lot of these tool sets today, if you have a good coder, they look at it and go, no, that's rubbish. We should go do this. And they'll refactor the code and all that sort of stuff, right? So, but, but that threshold will continue to increase. And, for the best programmers, it's a long way to go before they're going to be replaced, right? So generally you will see replacements start happening with very low skill sets, which is kind of a motivation to upskill as quickly as possible, which argues for learning. So there is no easy answer to the deep experience versus general. General, of course, because it gives you an advantage in seeing failure across domains, and seeing linkages that AI mightn't see because, again, most of their data is being created within a silo. They don't necessarily see how to connect those pieces, because many of the first principles stuff may be disguised in standards that we have taken as base data.
So if I can recap, you need to basically make your team to buy in in what you're doing.
Every entrepreneur has to do that, right?
Yeah, in every aspect, true. But when it comes even to learning or relearning the things the way how they're done, so you see it's a more like a carrot and stick approach where you sort of mandate them to do that, while yet empower and reward them for achieving a certain level of progress.
I think most people want to learn. I think there's a natural and inherent passion for people to increase their knowledge base. So I think number one is you just make it easier for them. Make sure they have the right tool sets, the right access to all this sort of thing, that you check in, that you show genuine interest, hey, and make it part of your discussion at your, meetings and things. And, oh, wow, I looked at this new cool tool set and this, and maybe create formal structures around how they share that learning with the team, right? So you get this amplification and multiplication out of a team. I mean, there are ways to go and do that, but I think it's an incredibly learning venture in capital. Start at learning, 100%.
I came across with the formula that you used when you applied the laws of physics into how you transform the organization. Could you elaborate a little bit and how we can apply this particular metrics into this use case with the adoption of AI within the organization?
Sure. So that goes back to Newton's three laws. And the three laws with an object is going to stay in a steady state of motion unless you apply force. And so, which means that if you're going to change an organization, you actually need to actively push to make things happen, right? But then Newton's second law is quite instructive, and it is for every action equal and opposite reaction, which means that all change is going to be resisted. But the third equation, which is force equals mass times acceleration, now is the most instructive, right? Because if for a given acceleration, or in finance, that's alpha, and for a certain mass, you need a certain amount of force. Now, if alpha's not negotiable, right? You're in it for growth. Then you're left with force and mass as your two variables, right? So if you've got a large mass, you want to move a big company, right? You're going to require a lot of force. So what's force? Your only variables in that is capital and people, right? So you're going to need a lot of capital and a lot of people to go and move that mass. Or you can do what Google and most companies do, is they create, a small group off to the side, like Alphabet, right? And they put DeepMind there because DeepMind was this small company and didn't have much mass, right? But they wanted the alpha. So now you've got rid of the mass, right? And replaced it with small mass, which means small force, right? To actually drive that given alpha. So now you let that grow to the point there to create, enough mass that you can actually make a meaningful impact back against the mothership, right? And that, for me, is always the best way to go and do major scale transformation.
Could you give a practical example how that might work?
Yeah, I think in banking, so you start with your first project that actually has the most likelihood of success, right? So, I think the first project out of the gate, I had to deliver three major things quite quickly. But one was, for instance, the mortgage, how to use that data, how do you make it valuable out, and once you get people engaged in those projects and they start seeing that transformation, then it gets to the point where they want to get behind it. So there's this great TED talk on how to create a movement. And I've forgotten the guy's name, but if you look it up, you'll find it easily enough. And it's about this wild guy dancing shirtless on a hill. And then after a while, two guys join him. And then the second guys that join him go and signal for others to join him. And everyone's sitting down. At first, you're thinking it's just a lone nut, right? And now the other guys start getting more people dancing on the hill. And then sooner or later, everyone's running to join the crowd because soon it's riskier to be left sitting down than it is to be part of the new crowd, right? And it's kind of like that inside organizations. You need to create that, that lone nut who finds the first supporters. So how that worked in one of the major institutions that I've worked for is we created a rebel group. We created some, grabbed a bunch of influential guys that wanted to, agreed that the antiquated process that we use for a lot of this stuff had to change and had to go digital. And this, rebel group got behind it and used their influence in the organization to, help sway and get things moving. And then, that created more and more people wanted to be part of that in crowd because, sexy, it's cool, but more than that, it's impactful and it's actually improving, what's happening at the bank. So in one other institution, as an example, in Japan, many years ago, another simple transformation. Everyone's going, no, you don't understand Japan, foreigner. I'm going, no one likes to spend a lot of time banking, and they're saying, but Japanese love the complex web pages and all this sort of thing. And I said, okay, that's your opinion. And this is my opinion, but neither my opinion nor your opinion matter. Let's have the customer make their opinion directly. So we did focus groups and all that. 100% wanted simpler. 100%. So we I did the initial drafts on just PowerPoint, create a new web page, get the key things we needed on it, and then negotiated with legal and all this sort of thing. So we finally got there, right? And of course, business boomed, right? We grew 25% in 6 months, right?
Just by changing the...
just by making simple... We had great... This is not to belittle the advantage we had in the market, but, the company was in a steep dive prior to some of these things. But what was more important was the staff reaction, right? So we were there, we have the happy coats on and everyone's kind of celebrating, because we're starting to be successful. And one guy hops up on stage, one of the, I'm not sure, somewhere in the bank. And he goes, at first we thought these foreigners were crazy, but now we see. And that's the important thing, right? Because now it goes back to experiential learning. Now they're part of it. And how you get to that transformation and how they get excited and they get engaged. It is like this shirtless dancing guy and lone nut on the hill, right? It's really not about the guy who, the innovation guy. I was the GM at that point. I was the GM of that group. So it's not about me, because if I could push all I like and I'm pushing against this big mass, nothing's going to happen. It's how do you get the people below to buy into the story, to get engaged with the program, and then to go and get the results that are sitting there in the market.
So using your analogy with the Newton law, so reducing the mass will help you to accelerate the change faster. It's just because it's easier to push. And you do it by sort of separating into the rebel group, where you give all this autonomy of failure and learning, and then essentially gives this as a sort of viral effect within an organization.
Yeah, but at the same time, you've got to prepare the big mass about, keep them updated with, the progress, the results, the impact, and and you'll get a lot of people that want to defect. One of the most common questions you have is, can we join your group, right?
Because it's cool and sexy and creative and...
No, because I believe every kid, when they're born, they're sponges, right? You have kids?
Not yet.
Not yet. When you do, it's like you can program them. They're fantastic, right? So, but they're sponges. They want to learn, right? And I think as kids, we have this amazing curiosity. We ask all these questions, right? But, I used to watch in Singapore, and it used to really sad for me. When my kids are little and any question, I answer every one of their questions. I never tire, because that's how they learn. And I see all these, I used to watch all these Singaporeans till they get shh, like this. And it's like, what on earth are you doing, right? You're expecting these great results from these kids, but you're conditioning them not to be curious. This doesn't make any sense for me, right? So you want to try and generate that curiosity inside the organization. You want people to be part of it. And I think inherently as individuals, we all, have that curiosity. We all have that creativity, right? Ask kids to go draw pictures. It's like, what on earth, right? So, and that's why, back to your question about young kids and their hope for the future, you've just got to harness that energy, that creativity. And because I think it's something that gets conditioned out of people, but naturally it's there. You just have to unleash it. And so I have great hope in that, that everyone innately has that capability. You've just got to learn how to reach it and give them for some that feel unsafe in moving forward with it, give them that level of safety where they can actually take, action. And the moment they do, it can be life-changing for them. Like literally I've had, a couple of folks that became top FinTech influencers and things. My former secretary was, went off to work in venture cap, right? So, what's possible is phenomenal. You just have to give people the opportunity.
When you should decide, and how do you decide whether you separate your organization in, say, two groups? One is maintaining existing processes, another one is sort of breaking the rules.
Yeah,
Is that the approach?
I don't. Well, firstly, in financial services, you never break rules, right? There are baselines, but when you're separate, it doesn't mean you necessarily operate by different rules. You manage with different boundaries, and you're very clear in those expectations and things. But it's not that you're disconnected and that there's this brains trust sitting to the side and they're going to change the world over here. And it's not an us or them thing at all. If you set it up as an us and them thing, it's never going to succeed. You need to have as strong connection as possible back. So the rebel group wasn't here. The rebel group was here. You tap the rebels who are frustrated or, who have that ambition to change. They see what needs to be done in their own, organizations. They're your rebel group. They're in the big mass, and you're kind of like prepping the way. You're helping give them access to tools, thinking, and you're learning from them at the same time, which helps you expand. Oh, wow, I can go do that. So you're never just a rebel group. You've got to work out how that relationship grows. Because if you just randomly try and inject in later, good luck. There'll be just resistance of the mass. You got to actually slowly, dare I say, like a virus, infiltrate the mass and get to its core. And that's not it's not easy, but it's also not hard if you can give people that platform, right? I'm a great believer in the possibility of people, right? I think you hire very smart people, they have, huge capabilities. You just got to learn to unleash them.
Would it create a little bit of a jealousy, or sort of dynamics, unhealthy dynamics of the organization, where they see, oh, there is a bunch of guys now with CEO is spending time with them, they love them, and we're left behind. And
so I've seen that,
or even worse, they are going to do something that will replace us with the technology.
Oh, no. So I've seen that. So let me give you a great example. I was working at an institution a while ago, and there was one group who absolutely and utterly did not want anything to do with the innovation group. Absolutely not. So what I did, which was perhaps a little bit sneaky, the CEO had forced me on them, which was great, but they really wanted nothing to do with us. And so I went out to a vendor and I said, look, there's this real need for this thing, right? And I want you to use your relationship to go into the bank and say that, you want to develop this new product with them, and this is how it's going to work and all this sort of thing. So I kind of spec'd it out and went through that process, right? And I said, but an important part of the pitch is to say that you presented it to the innovation group and that they were just too dumb to see it, right? Something like that. And they did it. And that group bought it, right? So I ended up getting what I wanted. Ended up getting the prototyping done for free because that group demanded it. And it was a thing. It didn't impact my budget, but I achieved my objective. So, that was around how to go and structure to, I was fine without the recognition. I just wanted the result, right? So, and I don't think anyone to this day still knows that happened. Though I kind of just blew it. But, you find any way that you can that goes and gets and unleashes that talent. They were incredibly talented folks over there. They knew their business. They were market leaders. They were all this sort of thing, right? They didn't understand digital, but you wanted a different way that was non-confrontive to go and get that result. And we did.
Let's imagine we went through this very complex task of having everyone on board, buy-in. The entire team is all in into learning, applying. There's a rebels group. The rebels spread the virus of innovation within the organization. Everyone equipped with new skills, and they applying the skills in a day-to-day job. Since AI is very nascent, we don't have experts in AI sort of yet, and everyone around in the market and the job market are looking for people with the right set of experiences and skill set. And the moment you say the CEO, the founder would be like, at the moment they would be, oh wow, we achieved this, we're doing a great job. The competitor comes and steals your best employees because they are the most equipped. You mentioned your secretary now that in the venture capital. How would you protect the company from having this situation? I mean, this is the sort of the potential outcome of your own efforts.
So, firstly, I've been in that situation many times, and I've always supported the people leaving if they didn't get what they needed from the company that they're in. This is within institutions, and to go and get that opportunity because it would broaden their experience. It's good for them and all that sort of thing, right? And some of those folks have gone off to become very senior folks in other organizations, which is kind of an indication of their talent anyhow. So I always think you always have the good of the individual in mind, and to pursue it and to let some of those things happen, right? Because, I think it's wrong to hold people back. You've created that hunger in them. You've created that capability, or you've helped catalyze it, not create it. And so I think I'm always supportive of those folks going out, and many of the folks that have worked for me have gone and crossed into different industries and all that sort of stuff, which is also interesting, right? Which shows the breadth and scale of what you can do beyond what used to be such a narrow job market, right? Oh, you can't work in insurance because you're a banker. I literally once was in negotiations with a bank in one country and then another bank in a separate country. And I've got the CEO of one bank going, oh, no, he's just a corporate banker. We don't want him doing this innovation thing. And then the other bank's looking at me and going, oh, no, he's just a consumer banker. We're after a corporate banker. I'm like, I've got the CEO of one saying I'm a corporate banker, and this other one saying that I'm a consumer banker. And it's like, I promise you, I know both. But people used to only want that narrow special field. And I think that going back to the broad thing, it's good to have, the broader look and that broader thing, because business is business. Coming from all the industries I work in, all run off the same accounting principles. They're all P&Ls, cash flows, balance sheets. Customers have certain expectations. You start seeing a lot of things that are just fundamentals that you can transfer, right? But to the people side, if you're in a startup with a small team, you've got to create a culture where they want to stay. And I've been lucky to attract people that could have been paid far more going and working out in a different company, but they were there because they, right on the mission, really want to see that, that change, that impact. And the reason goes back to, you're changing as a philosophy. The first value you're changing is for the customer, right? If you always hold the customer and you're creating value for that, people want to make an impact on other people's lives, right? Do you want to be the guy that says, well, during my tenure, I managed to get, 100 million people bankrupted? No way, right? Would you like to be the guy that says, I managed to get everyone on the planet a 10% pay rise? I mean, that's my objective, right? That one, who doesn't want to be part of that mission, right? To actually create something that creates a meaningful change and changes people's lives. And so I try and pick projects that do that. That's why, AIA Accelerator, we were lucky to have Danny Young, and because, which was Hong Kong's first unicorn, because he was doing something that had the ability to go and positively impact people's lives.
There are some teammates that may leave the organization to pursue their own startup, building their own ventures. What do you see that large organizations such as banks would be ready or more open to work with AI companies, nascent AI companies, or this will remain as similar like we've seen before? A lot of fintechs, a lot of POCs, dragging them until they run out and bleeding with cash, and then ended up with 9 out of 10. It was basically nothing, or the worst, the bank will just build this function on their own.
Yeah, so there's a lot of that goes on in the market, and I find that reprehensible from an institutional standpoint. The most valuable resource any startup has is time, and you should not waste their time. You have some major institutions in markets that are deliberately, dragging out and trying to soak in information with no intention of really buying and all that sort of thing. And I find that completely and utterly unethical. And I think that those companies should be publicly shamed, because you want that innovation to feed your market, right? So a better approach for me inside companies is, if you're going to work with startups, you've got to put something real on the table and enable that to actually happen. You've got to also use it as an opportunity for the company. It's like, okay, well, these guys are entrepreneurs. We're going to get behind them, and if they fail, then I'll go after their talent and give them a lifeline, because you want those people and those capabilities inside the organization. And absolutely, I would structure those deals to make sure that they're in the best interests of the outcome. Because if they deliver what you want and you can get the results out of it, then why wouldn't you want that deal in place? Now, if they fail, but they're really talented guys, wouldn't you want that talent on board, right? So, people and technology. So I think there's ways that the big companies can massively benefit from the startup community, but they look at it at the wrong lens, right? And, I think I'll give an example of an institution that I was advising, not an institution, a tech company. So it was Fortune 500 company in the US, and I was just an advisor, right? And I was looking at new tech and helping them redefine some interesting stuff, right? So there was this company in the US that was developing a synchronous sharing of files over the web. When that was brand new, right? Today, very common. And it was a company called FolderShare. And the US company was a US conglomerate that had kind of over its heyday, tech company, very cash rich. And they wanted to do a deal with this small company. Phenomenal technology, really good. So instead we said, fantastic, we want the tech. We could turn it into this fantastic, we had a very strong product view. We had enormous distribution capabilities, all this sort of thing. Now the problem was, as it is with working with most small startups, is it's probably going to take about 9 months before the small company sees money, right? And on a cash flow basis, that makes no sense. So we said, look, you need to go raise funding, all this sort of thing. And funding's always hard for every startup, except if you're a AI company who's just from founder that's just left GPT. but so it's hard. So what we'll do is we'll accelerate the cash to you. We'll take some of that and call it an equity, and we'll take a warrant that if we can outperform on distribution, that we actually get a top up on equity as well, which means that it's good for the company. They're way ahead, where, it means we're getting value out of the product and all that sort of thing. So to cut a long story short, that company ended up being acquired by Microsoft, now OneDrive, right? And as a company, that tech company made a return on capital of about 1,800% per annum. So there are ways to go structure deals, but they're non-conventional. That's kind of my specialty. But it's just math. Why wouldn't you? What's the downside of that equation? Even if that company had failed at really scaling the commercial tech, I think the company that I was working with would happily brought the talent on board to develop it out as a product.
There are a new generation of companies that offering AI solutions for enterprise. You look at different verticals with different sort of application of technology, from call centers to, automation of marketing, all this stuff.
Yep.
So from your experience, you've met a lot of founders coming to you with different innovation solutions. What is the common mistake that these companies do when they approach a large bank with whatever offering? Or what will be the winning strategy for them?
When you're coming from the outside, it's really you're in an force equals mass times acceleration thing, right? So I know that there are some institutions here in Hong Kong where some entrepreneurs are just endlessly pushing up, against that mass to the detriment of the mass, right? This is great. They're developing great stuff that could be used by that institution, and that would absolutely go and accelerate, their particular speciality. And then it comes along with talent and an insight that they could utilize in the worst case scenario that would still improve a lot of their core products, right? And I always wonder why. And I've been up against it. As an entrepreneur, I specialize in working capital management. So the stuff I went to a large institution in Hong Kong around working capital. This was after JP Morgan wanted to outsource globally working capital management to my little company in Australia. And the reason that deal fell apart is back then there was no FinTech, and I couldn't get enough insurance to cover the minimum requirement to become a vendor to JP Morgan, right? Go figure. So, right. And I worked...
Because the procurement system designed around the companies like Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, and like.
Voila, right? So, but this was a long time before FinTech was even a thing, right? So I went to an institution in Hong Kong, and then went to a guy. He wouldn't even meet with me, and I'm like, really? So, I was on Citi's global working capital team, all this sort of stuff. So then, when I ended up in DBS, I kind of like, I'm geeky. So I just wanted to see the result. Someone bought, one of the divisions bought into it. They ran with it. They owned it. They told me that they owned it, said they invented it. Fine, right? And now that's the profit engine of DBS Bank. And then the guy who was at the other institution went to go and lead that group.
Interesting.
Yeah, right. So why didn't you create that value back in your own organization, right? And I don't get it. I think organizations should be far more open to learning, and you are regulated, far up and beyond what a startup is. You've got to put the right cybersecurity around it, all that sort of stuff. I get it, right? But you want to take that talent and creativity, right? People are leaving very highly paid jobs in many instances to go create these companies. They're not dumb people, right? They're not just doing it on a whim. They're doing something about it. You should be curious enough to understand why they see that that's so valuable.
But from your experience, like say within Asia, did you see a lot of success stories of large banks would acquire technology from a smaller vendor, startup, or
it's strange. I really think it's a lost opportunity for those institutions. And you see companies like Revolut now, and it's funny, when they get to a certain size, everyone wants to try and work with them, right? And you got to ask yourself, well, that innovation was out there for a long time. You did nothing, right? You wouldn't partner with them when they were small. Why do you want them now? And the answer is because it's less risky for people to make those decisions, right? And I used to always laugh at that, because what is the core competence of a bank? You're in the risk management business, right? You should be looking at how you manage risk. And one of the biggest risks is being left behind, actually. People don't kind of look at it that way. But the reality is, if you start missing the market and some startup comes and starts eating your lunch, right? Which does happen, and increasingly it seems to be happening. So you can be completely and utterly left behind. So that, for me, that commercial risk is a really big thing. And I think that institutions don't have their game plans, because they look at it, they try and become VCs. So they set up their internal arms, and then they try and be VCs. It's like, but you guys aren't better VCs than VCs. And, maybe you should be looking at it from, like the structure for the tech companies. Look at it, how you can partner and acquire, either participate in the upside and get the return, or, acquire. There are a whole range of different ways that you can go and make value out of that relationship, right? And protect it. So, at Citi, we worked, this is 20 something, 25 years ago. So I suppose I can talk about it now. So, we started with a small Malaysian startup, right, which became their first, unicorn back then around e-billing, right? And, it ended up costing us very little because of the way we structured that deal at all to participate in what was at one time the hottest, startup market in FinTech. So quite interesting what you can do if you structure things the right way. And you've got to think that who are the best guys to go structure deals? It's like, well, usually bankers are very good at structuring deals, right? So why can't you structure deals for yourself? It's kind of weird.
Well, I feel like it's natural tendency for those, especially who used to work in a bank. They understand the certain inefficiencies. They go and start the venture. They go back to the bank. Look, we can do 10x better, but nothing happens. And maybe you don't really even need to take this path. I mean, go and disrupt the bank. Offer something. I mean, would it be like better? Like you mentioned, Revolut. They didn't go to the banks to offer their services. They started, okay, we are a better bank. Go
So
bank with us. Don't bank with these guys.
and
With Barclays.
and I think you've hit where I think the real traction is in the fintech market is to go and be your own institution and just deliver the capability to market. To try and convince someone that there's putting up these walls and this big mass and who are you to go talk to us? We're big and you're small. The reality is, yeah, I think there's a lot of latitude in markets to go and work out how you can actually be the one to actually, catalyze that transformation and make it real.
I remember there was a few years back, there was a massive trend of every bank would have their own innovation lab. I think, especially in Singapore, it was almost like subsidized by the regulator. Most of these innovation labs are gone. And often it was perceived as more like innovation theater rather than actual lab where innovation happened. I know that DBS was much better than many others,
But
but
we didn't do a lab. Sorry.
yes,
At the time I was there, we didn't do a lab.
right. But what's your take on that? Do institutions need to create an AI lab to tackle with the opportunities with AI? Would it be the approach?
No, I think you've got to work out how to put AI in the hands of everyone, right? So I don't think you need a lab to do it. If you're going to do a lab, as at AIA, we worked with Nest as an example, because we didn't have the competency in house to go do those sorts of things, and so I'm not sure it's really the competency of a bank to go and create a AI lab or all this sort of thing. I think go for me, what you want to do is work with a partner that you're able to then give people access to tool sets and all that sort of thing. And actually, to be fair to Microsoft, I think they're doing a great job with a lot of institutions in getting that moving inside large institutions. Being able to make it work and create products off the back of it, that's a different issue. But I think I've seen some super interesting stuff, which unfortunately I can't talk about. But it's what's possible with tech now is quite mind blowing, and you're starting to see a big shift on the tech industry side, and some great threats to current technology players by being able to utilize some of these tool sets effectively with the expertise of a bank behind it. Right. So super interesting. And, but for me, I'm not really sure you need a lab. That almost implies the exclusion thing. When I started at DBS, I said, you don't want to be like an innovation team shouldn't exist for too long, right? Because if you're successful, you've now got everyone that's innovative. So what do you need an innovative team? And actually what DBS ended up doing after some period after I left was they ended up creating the innovation team became the advanced technologies team. So it's continued to have a horizon look.
So it kind of implied that the rest of the team is not innovative at all. if you have an innovation team in a way.
No, to begin with, when you're bringing that new capability in, you've got to have something that catalyzes it in, right? It does need focus, but after a while, now the barriers to entry should be down, and so therefore you want to now focus that, you know, pipeline to more future-looking things, because now digital transformation was well and truly established, right? So I think, like all jobs, they should evolve over time, and that you know, there will always be advanced technologies and a need to understand those technologies and to look at application and to look at use cases and to look at how you create new asymmetries in the market.
Thank you, Steven. It was great to converse with you. We could carry on. I know we have I would have a lot of questions to ask you, but it was really a great pleasure talking to you.
No, thanks for having me. Greatly appreciate it. And you know, I've always been a fan of how you've catalyzed the Hong Kong market and beyond. And I think I look forward to continuing the relationship over many years to come.
Thank you, Steven.